When I think about the events of June 27th, 1844, my blood runs cold.
How do you deal with the widow of the prophet and their children?
They would be like the children of Abraham.
Joseph never had his children sealed to him.
In the fourth and fifth generation, the prophet's descendants will begin to come into the church.
And she said, he is your great-great-grandfather, but don't you ever tell anybody.
We are in an age where we have an abundance of access to resources that we've never had before.
They truly might be blood descendants of the prophet through a plural wife.
God will move in his own ways to bring all these puzzle pieces together.
For Emma Smith, the death of her husband Joseph might have been too steep a price to pay for faith.
As Joseph rode off to Carthage, according to a pioneer journal, 3 different times he said, "Emma, can you train my sons to walk in their father's footsteps?"
She tells him, oh, Joseph, you're coming back.
These were hard words to Emma, I believe, because it really had an ominous tone.
He said, "Emma, can you train my sons?" And she began to weep.
She does not want to have that conversation.
She kept pleading to Joseph, "You're coming back, you're coming back."
I think both of them comprehended at that moment that the possibility was very great that Joseph might not come back.
He said, "Emma, can you train my sons to walk in their father's footsteps?"
He must have had great trepidation about what would happen to his children.
Without her husband, Emma turned her full attention to the children and would try to make it on her own.
At the time of the prophet Joseph's death, his wife Emma was 40 years old and pregnant.
The Smith family was a very dynamic family, and within 3 years and 10 months, those pillars of Joseph and Hiram, of Don Carlos, of Samuel, of Joseph Smith Sr. were gone.
I think we expect Emma to behave in a completely uncharacteristic manner.
For her, her husband wasn't there anymore.
The oldest was Julia, who was one of the adopted twins. She was 13 years old. Joseph III, who was next, was 11 years old. Then Frederick, who was 8. Alexander, who I descend from, was only 6 years old. David Hiram was not yet born at this time.
Each of them had a different perspective of how they dealt with what happened.
She actually ended up just going into the mansion house, closing the door, and shutting out the world.
5 months after Joseph was killed, David Hiram was born.
When we look at what has happened to the family afterwards, it shouldn't surprise anybody that they are somewhat distressed people. Everybody thinks that Emma had to know everything that Joseph knew. She was the mother of his children. She was his friend, and certainly was one of the best hostesses of the whole world. But in the running of the church, it was the men who did the work.
In the years that followed, the fledgling church that Joseph established would experience the leadership of a different kind of man.
Brigham was in Boston. So when he heard, of course, he traveled back to Nauvoo as quickly as he could, but it was a long way.
What do you do for the widow of the prophet? There was no protocol, there was no precedent set or established.
Instead of being able to simply grieve over the loss of her husband and cope with her little children, she was faced immediately with the demands of business. Everything the church owned was in his name. Everything that the family owned was in his name. He had left no will.
She was the wife of the prophet, and other things happened to her that no one else had to deal with.
She had learned that where Joseph was not, her best interests weren't always uppermost in anyone else's mind.
In uncharted territory, the door would be opened wide for misunderstandings and offense.
People assumed certain things without knowing the facts.
One of the things that we've worked on very hard in the past year, or actually almost 2 years, is to find any documentary evidence of Emma and Brigham having bickered or quarreled face to face. And we cannot find any.
Emma Smith got on very well with all of the apostles. So there was no rift between Brigham and Emma until the death of the prophet.
They misunderstood her anxiety as a demand to take charge of the church.
He was human like all of the other prophets through all the ages have been.
There's some criticism that he didn't pay enough attention to Emma in her plight. And I'm sure he wished that he had just grabbed a minute here or there, you know.
Brigham Young was one person who, from the very first time he came to Joseph Smith, never betrayed her husband, and Emma recognized that.
We have a tendency to impose our own viewpoint on the past and our frame of reference on the past.
It's all a great tragedy. You almost could call it a comedy of errors, only it's not funny, because so many people with good intentions and well-meaning, righteous people were misunderstanding one another. Joseph and Brigham were, in a way, they were quite opposite to each other, and yet in another way they were very much alike, and that was that they were absolutely, totally dedicated to the service of the Lord.
Despite what Emma and her children suffered, Brigham was forced to concentrate on practical matters of the church.
Thousands of people were depending on him. Their lives even were depending on him.
A million things had to be going on through his mind.
Emma signs the deeds that they require for the church to have.
She felt she was fulfilling her lot to raise the sons, to look after her heritage, which was her family.
I think that's where her focus is all the remainder of her days.
They got the temple finished, they got the saints ready, and they did a mass evacuation, unparalleled in the history of the United States.
By that time, however, Emma had become fairly independent, fairly self-reliant, and comfortable where she was.
I think that they always expected that once she healed a little bit from the trauma, that she would come along and be part of everything.
Emma has this choice to go with them, to be in the society of loved ones and friends, and to feel the spirit that has permeated Nauvoo for several years.
They wanted so badly for Emma to go west.
And then on the other hand, to realize that if I make this decision to go west, then I risk, most certainly, Lucy, who at this time is so arthritic she can barely walk across the street by herself, the young children, David, who is just a couple of years old.
She said, I know the saints in Utah thought I wasn't a very good saint for not going west. She said, but I knew what my lot would be here. I did not know what it would be there. I've suffered till the Lord knows I've suffered enough. My husband, my children are buried here. I want to be buried here.
The majority of Joseph's followers would turn their sights with Brigham toward the west, while Emma remained behind in Nauvoo.
Estimates are 11,000 people went out of Nauvoo in the first Exodus.
When the church left Nauvoo, it left a ghost town.
During the Exodus, Emma is virtually alone.
She is left in Nauvoo with the farm, the homestead, the mansion house, and the Nauvoo house.
The saints, as they watched in their own lives what had taken place, they believed that Emma had been left in pretty good condition.
They had so much work to do to establish a new community.
Well, this hard condition that the saints are going through, I believe that there is some idea that Emma is back home in Nauvoo, living pretty well.
The perspectives on Emma Smith have been reflected through the eyes of people that made the journey west. Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, spent the rest of her life in Nauvoo. And I've never heard anybody criticize her for that.
And so I don't think they have the most reliable information that was given to them.
There was still no peace.
It was a dangerous place for a lot of months.
A great deal of property fell into Emma's hands, and everybody thought she was very well off.
There's something of a stigma that they will often apply to that kind of thing.
When the saints left, that took almost everyone that was there in Nauvoo. So there wasn't very many people left to patronize in the establishments that Emma had to be able to create finances for her and her family.
She also kept all the debts of the church resting upon her, which for the rest of her life, up to within 10 years of the end of her life, she was paying those debts.
I think the Lord could have manipulated Emma Smith to go west. He didn't. He told Joseph, and Joseph told Emma, that the Lord was going to give him a rest. Maybe he gave Emma a rest too. Sometimes the choices of people visit their family 3 and 4 generations down.
The decision Emma made to remain behind ensured, I believe, the survivability of his family. However, it may have cost them the fullness of the gospel.
Though the church would flourish in the West, eventually becoming one of the fastest-growing religions in the world, Joseph and Emma's posterity would remain relatively in shadow.
The promises that were given to Joseph regarding his posterity would be like the sands of the seashore, that they would be like the children of Abraham.
Joseph was busy, but he loved to spend time with young Joseph, and certainly had hopes for him.
Are these children going to be part of those blessings?
With the 9 children born to Joseph and Emma and the 2 they adopted, they have 11. But of the 6 to perish, we have 5 that survive the father, and only 4 survive the mother.
I'm sure that as the children were growing up, particularly in their young age, that they're hearing discussions, maybe even very bad rumors about their father's involvement, moral issues with polygamy.
There was pressure that's hard for us to imagine on the immediate sons of the prophet.
Even into their adulthood, there was some fear of becoming involved with some religious responsibilities they undertook themselves because of what they remembered, what happened to their father.
Despite their fears, Joseph's sons would participate in the reorganized Latter-day Saint movement. In time, however, their posterity's involvement in any religion would dwindle.
When Joseph dedicated the Kirtland Temple, he foresaw that perhaps his family for a time would be divided away from the church.
We know 2 things about the prayer that he had. He said that it was given to him by revelation, and that he read it in the congregation at the dedication.
Joseph says things perhaps that are now becoming clear to him as he's writing them.
And he told the Lord he was keeping his commitments. He wanted the Lord to bless his family.
He prays for his wife and children and all of their connections. And he asks that their prejudices may be broken up and swept away as with a flood, that they may be redeemed with Israel and know that thou art God.
I believe he knew for some time that his family would not have the fullness of the gospel.
He was facing issues within the family, but his own wife and children at the time of that dedication were completely faithful, and I should say his wife was completely faithful, and his little children were very little, and not even all of them had been born. As a young girl, I knew nothing of these things.
We never really had a discussion about our family heritage before. And
there were many of the descendants of Joseph and Emma who were a bit isolated from their roots, from the historical significance of their ancestors.
All of the family descendants that I sought out 35 to 40 years ago told similar stories of how difficult it was to be a descendant of a prominent person.
I brought home my American history book, and my mother saw Joseph Smith's name in the book. And she said, "He is your great-great-grandfather, but don't you ever tell anybody."
They believed their progenitor was a good man, but they had many unanswered questions themselves. And rather than ask and learn, most of them chose to just remain silent.
As a result of that kind of quiet secrecy, many of them don't even know that their neighbor just down the street is also a Joseph Jr. descendant.
There was some real strong, heartfelt emotions about Brigham and Utah Church.
Most people, when they're investigating the church, they have to gain a testimony of Joseph Smith. For the descendants of Joseph Smith, they have to gain a testimony of Brigham Young.
I just wasn't really interested in the history of the church and the history of Joseph Smith until recently.
When I was a child, I read a statement by José Smith in which he said, "In the 4th and 5th generation, the prophet's descendants will begin to come into the church."
One of the missionaries, one of the young men, handed me that little book, and he said, "This is the Book of Mormon. It was translated by the gift and power of God by your great-great-grandfather, and it is true."
I learned I was the first of Joseph and Emma's posterity to receive the Melchizedek priesthood. And from that point on, it was just a learning process for me to know a lot more about my heritage. During the 2005 birthday celebration of Joseph Smith, we brought the family together to talk about the legacy that Joseph left us. Well, 2 years later, when we gathered again in Nauvoo in 2007, we wanted to focus on Emma. And the nemesis associated with her is what happened between her and Brigham Young.
The Brigham Young family has participated with us in our family reunion in 2007.
The president-elect of the Brigham Young Family Organization, Mary Ellen Elgren, felt extremely moved to help us in this cause and produced a letter.
In response to Mike Kennedy's request, they produced a beautiful letter with text that invites all of us to take a new look at the relationship that existed between Joseph and Brigham, which was so close, so brotherly, and then their mutual love of the Savior and their desire to fully accomplish the work that he asked of us as a church, and then their pledge to do all in their power to correct any misunderstandings that might exist.
From the Brigham Young Family Association. For a century and a half, we have grieved over the loss of the fellowship of our dear Emma Hale Smith, her children, and her descendants. We feel in our hearts an abiding longing to join once again these two families in a common celebration of their ancestors, two men who loved each other and gave their lives together in the service of the Lord Jesus Christ. The prophet Joseph Smith, who stands at the head of this dispensation, is second only in our affections to the Lord himself, and we hold in the highest esteem our progenitor, Brigham Young, whose dying words in this world were the repeated name of his greatest friend and mentor, Joseph. If there are any misunderstandings that continue to exist in the lexicon of traditions in our family concerning the prophet's beloved wife, whom we revere as a truly great and saintly lady, we would commit ourselves to do whatever is needed to publish to the world our great regard for her noble life. It would be our earnest desire to rebuild that bridge of friendship between our two families that existed not so long ago. Please accept our regrets for things past and things lost, and our hand in love and fellowship for the future where all is to be gained. And this was signed by all of the officers and board of directors of the Brigham Young family.
Because of his death, Joseph never had his children sealed to him. Now it's up to the posterity to restore those blessings and those ordinances.
It's been more than 160 years since the death of Joseph Smith, Jr. Most of his posterity living today are third, fourth, and now fifth generation descendants.
Joseph and Emma only had about 1,500 descendants, both living and deceased. There's probably shortly over 1,000 of them that are actually living today.
When Joseph dedicated the Kirtland Temple, he foresaw that perhaps his family for a time would be divided away from the church.
As we read the prayer in the Kirtland, the dedicatory prayer, we begin to see prophetically things that today seem, oh, well, yes, prejudices certainly.
And he told the Lord he was keeping his commitments. He wanted the Lord to bless his family, have mercy on his wife and his children, convert them, bring them back.
When we see that they didn't come west, we look at that promise, and what it does is give us hope that his posterity will begin to come into the church and take that position, which is exactly what is happening now.
It's an amazing thing that we're now seeing. Every time Gracia and I go to speak somewhere, and I talk about how many of Joseph's descendants have come to the church, she has to give me the elbow and say, it's this many more, it's this many more.
There's been a lot of changes in the family that we feel the softening of the hearts have begun in the last several years.
The first time we spoke together, it was 102. The next time it was up to 115. Then it went up to into the 120s, and now I think it's 129.
It's a prophetic utterance in that dedicatory prayer of things that just today are starting to happen that some individuals have tried to bring about in the past.
The Searching for the Family has been a lot of fun as we've gone to visit and we've called up people. We've had one, when we gathered the family in 2005, we had one call us up and say, I just received some of your mailings. Well, I'm not a Smith. And then I had to tell her, yes, you are a Smith. And I called up our cousin Gracia, and Gracia called up this girl's grandmother. And so the grandmother called up her granddaughter and said, yes, you are a Smith. So it has been a lot of fun to gather them together.
For a long time, we had none of Joseph's descendants. Now we have 129.
I believe that Joseph and Emma are deeply involved from beyond the veil in all the things that are unfolding in our lives today.
We're now at a place where we can bring this to closure. We can bring these families back together. And that's what we're doing. And I'm so thrilled to be able to be part of that. It's a wonderful thing.
I believe that they are involved and that they love us, that they love the people of this dispensation.
People often wonder, because of plural marriage being such a prominent doctrine in the church, if there are other blood descendants of the prophet Joseph.
There have been several who have felt, because of the traditions of their family, that they truly might be blood descendants of the prophet through a plural wife.
If I have Joseph Smith's DNA inside of me, then each of my cousins will have the same DNA markers. And by comparing that to anybody else who claims that they are descendants of Joseph, then we would know.
As far as I can tell, any single claim that we were able to test resulted negative.
We know of none today. The history has tried to identify as many as 3 and hinted that there may be more, but the posterity of any of those today have been DNA tested, and they aren't related to Joseph.
None of them resulted to be a child of Joseph Smith, a biological child.
If we find DNA evidence that they are a literal descendant of Joseph, then they are a literal descendant of Joseph. They will become part of the family.
Our goal is to gather these dear cousins and have them know us and for us to know them and to be able to get acquainted with each other.
There are things within the family that the public is interested in. And there's also things that are in a broader public domain, historical understandings, for example, that the family has in many respects not been familiar with.
The nature of the Historical Society is to become a public repository for information.
In my family, I had records that were passed down from one generation to the next that I received. And other family members have had the same thing.
It's clearly something that is built on the work that many other volunteers and people have been doing over many years.
Here we are with this wonderful organization to pull together the knowledge.
That we may have a greater understanding of the legacy of not only Joseph, but his wife Emma.
We are in an age where we have an abundance of access to resources that we've never had before.
When I think about Joseph Smith and the great work that he did, the miraculous efforts that he put forth in laying the foundation for the gospel on the earth, I believe that today what he would want most for his posterity would be that they would all partake of the things that he gave his life to.
There's some members of the family who haven't spoken to each other or seen each other for 2 generations.
Unfortunately, that's very difficult because they're so scattered.
The Joseph Smith Jr. Family Organization is primarily for the descendants of Joseph and Emma in the gathering process.
It's been something that has brought them together.
All the history has come more alive to me. Plus, now that I'm older, it's more interesting to me than in my youth.
So that's what we're about today, is to try to help educate, to find them, to fellowship and be friends.
It's a wonderful thing.
Joseph has done much for this world, not just for the religious issues, but there's much else that we can learn from him.
Our goal is to gather these dear cousins and have them know us and for us to know them and to be able to get acquainted with each other.
One of the reasons we created the Joseph Smith Jr. and Emma Hale Historical Society is for those who are not members of the family to participate and be involved with the information.
Well, the Historical Society is not that old, and it's quite remarkable that it's been able to accomplish as much as it has in a very short period of time.
I am so excited about the Historical Society.
There are a lot of programs and initiatives that will be coming out over the next several years that will allow for a greater participation and a greater opportunity for involvement for people.
The Joseph Smith Jr. Emma Hale Smith Historical Society is organized for the purpose of helping sponsor the projects that need to be done to gather the histories.
That the Historical Society is doing something of a pioneering work in the sense that it, for me anyway, has reoriented how I think about the whole concept of family history.
We would like to invite many who are willing to contribute to the understanding and the gathering of the Joseph Smith family to participate with us in the Historical Society.
Being associated as a descendant of Joseph Smith has been a tremendous blessing in my life.
There's a heritage that particularly us as descendants of Joseph and Emma need to be very proud of.
We know that that carries significant promises and blessings. It also carries extreme responsibility.
He made known to me who the Christ is. He taught me how to return back to our Heavenly Father. When I kneel in prayer, I understand because of Him who I am praying to.
Today, the Joseph Smith Jr. and Emma Hale Smith Historical Society is in contact with nearly all of Joseph and Emma's living posterity throughout the world. Their mission? To promote the family and scholarly understanding of the life and times, teachings, and heritage of two of America's truly remarkable figures.